Okay.
You don't tend to see those in the Tamarotsu images other than short lugs. This is more of a German design.
And this sword is based on which specimen? For example, they were made like the original ones in Italy, or were they made in all over Europe?
This type was particularly popular in Germany,
Oh, in Germany.
um, but we find them in museums all across Europe. You'll find them in the Stibbert, you'll find them in the UK and the Arundel collection. You'll find them all over the place, and they were handed out sometimes as a mark of honor to people. In the Italian tradition, you will often find when a master writes a book, he'll have himself depicted with one of these because it's the last weapon you learn, and it was a particular symbol of mastery to have one of these great swords.
Uh, why was it a sign of mastery? Because it was hard to learn it. That's why they taught it at the end of the curriculum, or what was the reason?
Yes, you need to have developed to a certain point. So you need to have taken on board the lessons of the previous weapons in order to be able to then understand this. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, you go through different stages of progression and increase in doing so the weight and adaptability of the weapons. So you're with the side sword alone, you're starting to develop the musculature, but just as importantly, the footwork and spatial awareness and the understanding of how to move as a sphere and how to circle your opponent, like in boxing with ring craft and understanding how to control your environment and your opponent. And then if you were to just start immediately with a great big sword like this, you'd be focusing far more on holding the thing or keeping it moving or how tired you're getting. Whereas with the side sword, you'd be able to work for longer and get to the point where you can actually start using heavier and more complex weapons.
That's right. I mean, I'm not a big fan of comparing weapons to each other because it's like anyone in modern military knows that, you know. I mean, there are different guns. You know, I was just talking to one of U.S. Marines, and he was talking about, you know, weapons they were using in Afghanistan in a battlefield or whatever. There are different weapons in today's warfare, and back then it was not different. But just out of curiosity, I know this question is not very. Can I say that the long sword is, in general, of course, it doesn't have the power of the sword you have, but a long sword is faster? Can I say that, or you cannot say that in your opinion?
Well, define faster. The longsword is lighter, so you might be able to move the point faster. But if you think of a point of rotation, the end of this will travel a further distance with greater velocity.
It will, absolutely. Very good answer. And the second question I have, when I look at this sword behind you, I cannot stop thinking, this is like a pole arm. So if you have that, you don't need a pole arm anymore, right? You understand what I mean? Why do you need a pole arm if you have such a thing, you know?
Well, yes, and it's in many ways it's used in the same way, but it also has a certain amount of versatility to it with the reversal of the weapon. So I suppose a lot of the lessons do carry over into the pole arms as well. But the sword, if we think of the sword has a particular place in the consciousness. No one has ever ascribed any particular nobility to a pole arm, for example. Whereas the sword is held to be some symbol of honor with which a gentleman will defend himself and his virtues. And this carries on to us today as well.
Yeah.
I mean, even within Christianity, the sword holds a particularly distinguished position within the text of the Bible.
Yes. Could you please expand on that? I'm really interested because lately I have been reading a lot on Templars and the Knights and Hospitallers and all these things. Could you just tell me more about that? The sword in Christianity and Bible. I would be very interested in that.
Well, Jesus Christ told his followers to sell their cloaks and buy swords to defend their beliefs and the path that they had chosen. So certainly the sword holds an important place.
Certainly, very interesting. Okay, let's just move on from this large sword and move on to other types of swords. What else do you teach, Jay, in your school? I mean, let's stick just to swords, then we can go to other weapons. What else do you teach in your school? So,
other than swords?
No. Other types of swords. For example, do you teach side swords, rapier, small sword, basket hilt sword? Just please explain these different types you teach.
We practice with the Italian side sword and with the great sword. We don't move into the 17th and the 18th century with rapiers and with small swords, although we do also sometimes look at basket hilts when we're looking at the English systems.
Why don't you concentrate on rapiers? Because many schools also love doing rapier swordsmanship or fancy.
Of course, but our work is around a specific period, which is within the 16th century. So although rapiers had begun to develop by that point, it hadn't reached the rapier's heyday, which was really in the early 17th century and then into the third quarter of the 17th century.
Absolutely. Okay, let's go one step back to side sword. Please explain to our viewers what is a side sword.
A side sword is a cut and thrust blade, but it's an artificial term. It's a modern term. The Italians just used the word sword. When we now today use the word rapier, we're talking about a long, primarily thrust-orientated weapon with a complex hilt. But we had complex hilts and blades of various lengths throughout the 16th century as well. I think what we today see as a side sword is an Italian-style grip where you put your finger over the quion, and a blade that is equally optimized for thrusting and cutting.
Oh, interesting. And may I say so, a heavier blade, right? Just for our viewers to understand, compared to a rapier, a heavier blade. Can I say that? So,
no, rapiers tended to be heavier than side swords. The blades were longer. They tended to be thicker, not wider, but thicker. And I found in some places we found rehilted longsword blades in early rapier hilts. So no, in fact, the side swords tended to be lighter. There were exceptions, of course. There were many variations within the blade design over the course of 100 years, as you would expect.
Yes.
You had wide flat blades, which were far more optimized for cutting and just wanted to dance in your hand. And you had narrow blades with central ribs, which were clearly designed to be better in the thrust. So again, the term side sword is artificial. And the word rapier was already being used at the time to differentiate the English style blades from the Italian style in London.
Which comes to my mind before, and I don't want to change the topic, but I'm just, why were Italians coming to England to teach? Why not Spanish? Why not French? And now this is a question which I always have had, right? Why not Spanish?
Well, there was a certain amount of animosity with Spain at the time, because obviously Philip had claim to the throne of England. And when Elizabeth took the throne, Spain saw it as their right, or at least an opportunity to add England to the Habsburg Empire. And yes, of course, through this developed a certain amount of xenophobic and religious fear, because the previous monarch had been Catholic and had been pushing to bring the Catholic faith back into England. And there's a certain amount of misinformation around this. Everyone thinks that there's these stout Protestants standing up to Catholic aggression, which is nonsense. Henry VIII had decided to become Protestant as a purely political ploy. It was purely for benefit. But when he died, he had Catholic mass spoken over him. And many people, they still follow the old Catholic ways. And Protestantism was a much more gradual process to implement in England. Even under Elizabeth, she attempted very hard to keep a balance between the Catholics and the Protestants. But with the political tension with Spain, it became more and more difficult. And of course, there were flarings and individual cases of outright aggression between the two groups. And Catholics went underground. And where you have groups existing in secretive societies, this gives an opportunity for espionage. And spycraft, again, flourished under Elizabeth.
Of course. Okay, back to Sidesword for our viewers. Jay, could you please explain to them, Sidesword is, you just handle it with using one hand, generally, right? Am I correct?
Yes, correct. So what we have here is really a German-style hilt, a Saxon hilt, with a complex design. But sorry, I'm trying to see where the camera is.
Yes.
But what you're doing is you're placing the finger over the cross here and locking it in place with the thumb. And it gives you mobility and control of the blade by doing so. But when you're throwing a cut, you can shift your grip. And you're holding on with this finger here, which allows for the stramazzone, which is a wheeling cut from the wrist. So you're not forced to lock your wrist here and then turn the hand and throw the cut. But with a stramazzone, you can just drop the blade and release. And then, sorry about that. And then with a tension of the hand, you can then flick the blade on the other side. Unfortunately, I don't have the space here to really demonstrate effectively.
Sure.
But yes, the different grip design allowed for a different dynamic in fencing.
Okay, very good. And the blade of a side sword was generally double-edged. Am I correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, generally it was a double-edged blade. There are backsword style blades, which we find also in Italy, but they were far rarer and more unusual in the Italian, what's now the Italian nation.
Okay. Once you use a side sword, Jay, what do you do with your offhand? Do you put it next to it like the Filipino styles to trap and to engage, or do you put it behind your back when you use a side sword?
The hand tends to go behind the back, but when you get close to the opponent, the hand shoots out to engage. So especially when you're starting to teach students, I find this is actually beneficial as well. You don't want to start teaching students with the hand out here unless you have something in that hand, because it creates another target. So we start off by teaching people the one-handed sword and the hand is behind the back where it's out of the way. Then we start showing them how to engage at close measure. So you start at wide measure, which means that you're at a distance where to strike at your opponent, you have to extend with the foot in order for the blade to be able to make contact. Narrow measure is when you've become so close that your blades are crossed and you could just extend the arm to thrust at the other person. So you're within the time of the hand, as Silver would put it. And this is also where you would end up in a grappling situation. And after that, you then start putting offhand weapons into the mix. So we start off with the small buckler being a small shield that just covers the hand. And then you start moving with the two weapons and learning how to keep the arm extended either out here or withdrawn, depending on the situation. I can't really break down the entire system in this video. But yes, we start off with a very simple single sword in your hand, and then we start moving on to more complex combinations.
Okay, let's go to sword and buckler, and this is a very interesting topic to discuss. The sword and buckler you teach, it has nothing to do with 133, the German style 133, correct?
It's a different system. There'll always be similarities. So in 133, we see certain guard positions that, especially what's in the Italian systems is called sopra and sotto il braccio. We see that quite prevalent in 133, where you have the blade over or under the shoulder when you've withdrawn it after throwing a blow. But these are, of course, purely transitional guards. And I think what we see in 133 is demonstrations of how your opponent should take, or how the maybe the antagonist in the book, I'm not really familiar with the text intimately, can take advantage of someone who has just thrown a cut. So basically seizing the tempo.
In 133,
so there'll always be similarities between fencing texts.
Please correct me.
I think we have some lag here.
I'm just asking questions, so you need to correct me, of course, please,
of
right?
Course.
By assumptions. Is it that, can I say in 133, the tendency compared to Italian school, they tend to hold buckler and sword more together compared to Italian system? Can I say that? The tendency.
I believe they do, but I'm not familiar enough with I-33 to say definitely. In the Italian school, when you're performing certain actions, you do want to use the buckler to cover your hand. But the Italian school also teaches, first with the single sword and then also with the sword and buckler, a more withdrawn guard stance, or more withdrawn guard stances. So you're not leaving your hand out there where it can be attacked. When you do, that is a transitional step. And in doing so, you want to be using the buckler to protect the hand against your opponent.
Okay, I have a question, and this is a very interesting question. Imagine you have a side sword, you put your offhand normally behind, and you learn to wield it. So because I don't want to give a target, imagine once I have an engagement and I feel that the blade is engaged, I bring it and can go to grappling range. Okay. Now I have another. So in this case, I'm not protecting my sword hand with anything. But when buckler comes in play, all of a sudden, I start to protect my sword hand. But before buckler, I was not protecting my sword hand. Do you understand, Jay? Can you help us explain the difference?
I do, but this is what I mean by a withdrawn guard. You're not putting your hand within reach. You're keeping your hand back and the point directed to the opponent. When you then engage with the opponent by crossing the blades, you can feel the opponent's blade. If they disengage to do something, you can see what they're doing. And you want to create a situation where you're always safe from certain angles. You want to limit the choices that your opponent has on where to attack you. So this is why you always have to be thinking several movements ahead. So the buckler is there to protect the hand when the hand is already forward. So when you're creating an opportunity for your opponent to attack the hand.
Yes, absolutely. I understand that. But once there is no buckler, how do you protect your sword hand not to be hit? Your sword hand, not your offhand. But just by making sure that your sword moves well, you defend with the sword blade, correct? Once you have a buckler, you have two possibilities to protect yourself. Your sword hand. I'm just talking about sword hand.
Yeah. No, I do understand what you mean, but you protect your sword hand the same way you would in any other system by not giving your opponent the opportunity to attack it.
Okay.
If your opponent, if you force your opponent to take a larger action in order to be able to reach your hand, you can seize that tempo and seize the opportunity.
Yes, absolutely. Very good, very good. Okay, and the side, I saw your side sword. It has always a complex hilt, what you teach, correct?
No, we always start with a simple hilt because I want to teach my students not to rely on a complex hilt to defend their hands. Okay. Because otherwise we end up in the situation you're describing, where they put their hand forward and it just gets sniped.
Yes, that's right. That's correct. That's correct. Because in in this 133 system, they use like a simple, not a complex hilt. They use like a crossguard sword, right? If I
Yes.
it's like an arming sword, if I'm correct calling it that way. Okay, I understand that.
Yes, and in fact, if you look at some of the images from the Bolognese system, they're depicted using also just a simple crossguard, but with the finger over the cross over the quion. So again, you shouldn't have to rely on finger rings to protect your fingers against strikes. You should be keeping your hands safe. But I do insist I do insist on finger rings in my school because I don't want someone to get their finger trapped over the crossguard in an engagement.
Okay, very interesting. And what types of bucklers do we have, and what types of bucklers do you teach and use in your school?
We teach small buckler, large buckler, and targa. So a buckler is specifically a relatively small shield that's used with a center grip. We avoid the ones that have a large bridge on the back because those can rotate fairly easily. And in Docciolini, he specifically advises to use a straight grip and to place your thumb on the inside rim, and we go by that advice. The small buckler, to me, is something that would be carried easily at the belt, and is also the first thing that you learn to use, because then you're not overly reliant on the buckler. The small buckler is mostly to protect your hand or to cover an angle as you're stepping in. The larger buckler is almost more of a military variant. It's a larger shield from shoulder to shoulder, which you can keep extended out in front of you. So practically the size of a breastplate, extended at arm's reach. And I think the art in that case is more getting around it than really protecting yourself with it. The targa has squared off edges, which when you start using it really makes a difference in arresting the blade, because it doesn't slide around it. It is caught directly on that edge. But sorry, I interrupted you.